Here with us this evening. My name is Michael Paterakis, and I'm chair of NIFA's Elliott Bell Award Committee. Tonight's ceremony takes place under unprecedented circumstances. When we convened to select this year's winner last April, we were hoping tonight's ceremony to take place under a more favorable climate. Of course, that didn't happen. Nevertheless, we are honored to present this evening's award to Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Zweik for his decades of service helping average Americans navigate the often murky world of investing and to make the most out of their retirement savings. Of course, due to COVID, we have to make things a bit different. So let's hear from the president of our organization, Matt Nelko.
Hello, my name is Matt Nelko, and I'm the president of the New York Financial Writers Association, coming to you from my home, as have so many of us during our pandemic pause. Since our nation's bicentennial, the New York Financial Writers Association has bestowed the honor of the Elliott V. Bell Award, named for our inaugural president, to a distinguished financial journalist whose body of work has contributed significantly to the field of financial journalism. This year, I am proud to bestow that honor to Wall Street Journal columnist and author Jason Zweik. We are recognizing Jason for his decades of work in helping ordinary Americans understand the intricacies of investing. He's done this through his insightful writing for the Journal, his appearances on CNBC, and through his many books, including Your Money and Your Brain. Jason, on behalf of the New York Financial Writers Association, it is my honor to bestow the Elliott Bell Award. And there you are.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thanks to everyone for being here, wherever that is. What an honor and privilege it is for me to share this award with so many colleagues, mentors, and friends. I worked for the second winner of the Elliott Bell Award, the great Jim Michaels, for almost 9 years. When he made me Forbes' mutual funds editor in 1992, I asked him for advice. He said, "Don't get anybody's blood on your hands," by which he meant we have an unshirkable duty never to pander to our readers and never to repeat Wall Street's propaganda without scrutiny. And the 34th and 35th winners, Alan Sloan and Gretchen Morgensen, who'll join me on this evening's panel, have been my ethical exemplars for decades. I've worked with at least 11 previous winners of the Elliott Bell Award and am friends with many more. I can't possibly name every winner I admire because I admire them all. I'd like to thank my wonderful editors at the Journal, mainly Charles Farrell, Emily Gitter, Eric Holm, and especially Dave Riley, who never stops pushing me to dig deeper and write tighter. And now, a quick word about something that isn't true. Journalists on other beats seem to look down on us, as if, while they're exploring important ideas and lofty ideals, we're rooting around in the septic tanks of society. I've heard other reporters say, "Oh, that's just service journalism," as if serving our readers by helping them make better financial decisions were somehow beneath the dignity of people who cover, say, professional sports or Congress or the White House. What nonsense. If the point of journalism isn't to serve our readers, what is the point? As the writer Peter Bernstein said, "Believe me, when people have told you about their money, they have told you the most important fact about themselves. Their sex lives, problems with their children, their political views are all secondary." To enlighten people about money is to illuminate what is often the darkest and most anxiety-ridden part of their lives. Every time we expose a fraud or demystify a complexity, we help make someone's future more secure. Financial journalism is beneath nobody's dignity. Done right, It's as noble a calling as I know of. And it's fascinating because of what it tells us about human nature. Markets are quoted in numbers, but what they trade in is emotions. Markets simply determine prices for risks and rewards over time. Among those risks are not just financial losses, but the surprise and fear and regret they bring. Among those rewards are not just monetary gains, but hope and greed and pride. Along that axis of time, all these emotions play out as people become unimaginably rich and then go bust, turn from nobodies into geniuses and then into fools, as the goddess of fortune spins her wheel, raising the last to be first, then spinning it again and relegating the first back to last. The goddess of fortune, though, operates from behind a curtain. Our job is to lift the curtain and show everyone that she's there, silently, blindly, capriciously turning her wheel again and again and again, as she will until the end of time. I like to say that the financial markets are the greatest show on earth, and at the Wall Street Journal, I have a front row seat at the circus. Even so, once every few weeks, I think we'll have to run white space where my column is supposed to be. Yet, lo and behold, the market always provides a bubble, a crash, a scam, a scandal, a comeback from nowhere, a hot hand gone cold, a reputation gone wrong, a fund manager gone rogue, a computer program gone wild. And so, just in the nick of time, I get my latest glimpse of which way the goddess of fortune has spun her wheel. And there's my 800 words for the weekend. So, when I heard I'd won this Lifetime Achievement Award, my first thought was, oh no, my career is over. My second thought was, I want to be the first person to win this thing more than once. So I'm not ready to give up my front row seat at the greatest show on earth. The show must go on, and it will go on. And we will expose it, cover it, explain it, and illuminate it. And if we do our job right, we will not only help our readers understand the financial markets, we will help them understand themselves. Thank you again. I'm delighted to be here with my old friends, Alan and Gretchen. As I mentioned in my thank you remarks, the two of us have known each other a very, very long time. And it seems appropriate as old timers that we talk a little bit about what keeps us going, because maybe that will be helpful to other people. And we don't pretend we have all the answers, but maybe we might know most of the questions at this point. So let's start just by talking about how we got into financial journalism in the first place. And I'll ask you to kick us off, Alan, and then Gretchen, and then I'll jump in.
Well, I got into financial journalism completely by accident. There's a whole story I'll spare you, but in the late 1960s, I found myself in Charlotte, North Carolina, direct from Brooklyn, New York, with no intervening stops. And back then, Charlotte was just this hick town, and I was a sports writer at the Charlotte Observer because that was the only job I could find. The problem was I wasn't any good at writing sports. Plus, I worked on weekends, and I was about to marry the people known to our friends as the long-suffering Nancy Sloan, who still, after 51 years, put up with me. She taught French in Gastonia, North Carolina. If I were a sports writer, not only would I never go anywhere, I'd never see her because, I was away when she was home. So I asked them to make me a feature writer. Instead, they made me the real estate writer. And I found out later, hoping I would leave because I was a pain in the behind. But it turned out that I actually liked writing about real estate. I could find numbers. I learned how to read documents, and all sorts of people of my age who were feeling oppressed by the older people would come and tell me things. And that got me started writing about real estate, writing about utilities, writing about this, writing about that, because it was a completely open field and no one had ever written any of it before. And I'm still at it after 50 years, still having a good time.
Gretchen?
Well, thanks, Jason. I wanted to say I really, really loved your speech. That was so heartfelt, and some stuff I didn't know about you. But anyway, and congratulations. I'm really thrilled for you. So, you know, like you say, we're old timers. So I go way back to, you know, the period of time when I wanted to be a political reporter. So when I graduated from college, that was in the midst of the Watergate era. Political reporters were, you know, gods to me, and that was my ideal. I went to New York from my small Midwestern college, and nobody cared that I wanted to be a journalist. And so the best job I could get was as a secretary at Vogue magazine. Now, so it's a little bit of a weird, you know, trajectory, right? But what happened was I basically kind of elbowed my way into writing their personal finance column over a period of several years. And they only had a personal finance column because they would sell an advertisement against the page. I am convinced that no one ever read it. But in any case, I then decided that I could not make it in New York on my own, making $10,000 a year. And so I went to Wall Street and I became a stockbroker. And that's really, Jason, where I learned how to understand sort of where the bodies are buried at financial firms. I really got what I call sort of a working man's MBA, learning how capital formation works, learning how investing works. And it was a great, great experience for me. So that was really sort of my failure as a stockbroker. I only lasted 3 years, but it really gave me a tremendous leg up on understanding the way the world works in finance and investing. And from then on, it was off to the races for me.
Yeah. Wow. So continuing the theme of serendipity, I became a business journalist by complete sheer accident. I had fallen into a job as a fact checker at Time magazine back in the days when they had fact checkers, and I guess Time was a magazine. I kind of stumbled around a bit, doing fairly well, liking it, I thought. And then Time Inc. Got a takeover offer from Coniston Partners. Alan and Gretchen will remember them pretty well. And the company did a bunch of cutbacks, and fact checkers got the first axe. And somebody I knew somebody who knew an editor at Forbes and got me an introduction. And the next thing I knew, I was a business journalist. And that was that. It wasn't what I wanted to do. It wasn't what I intended to do. It wasn't what I thought I would enjoy doing. But after about 6 weeks of doing it, I said, you know, this is fun. People care about this stuff. And you can do it well and help them, or you can do it poorly and, you know, not justify your own existence. So that was 33 years ago, but who's counting? So why do we keep going, guys? Gretchen, you want to?
Well, first of all, it's fun. It is never the same. I mean, you know, the scams are sort of basically the same, but there's always a different element. And so if you're, you know, policing the markets for bad behavior, you know, it's always a slightly different story, certainly different characters. It's so much fun. You get to satisfy your curiosity. You get to ask questions. You get to learn. You get to be nosy, which is of course fun. So, you know, there's so much about it that is really invigorating. And as you said in your introduction, you know, you have a front row seat for a lot of very interesting stuff. You know, front row seat for mayhem, a front row seat for market exuberance, a front row seat for, you know, Bernie Madoff. I mean, some of the big names, Enron, et cetera. So, you know, it's a great way to, you know, you're learning, you're talking to intelligent, fascinating people, and you're helping people to understand what's going on.
Alan, what keeps you going?
All right. I'm by far the oldest of the three of us. I'm 75. I retired from Fortune 5 years ago, and I've been working out of my house ever since. And the first reason I have to keep going is if I didn't have a job, my wife would kill me. I need, you know, something to do and to stay out of her hair. But I enjoy this stuff. I'm back when I could travel and go see the people at ProPublica on a train ride, or hop a train to Washington, you know, the Washington Post, and go wander around the newsroom. It was endless fun. And to me, the challenge is to take esoteric things and explain them in ways that average people can understand. And one of the things I'm proudest of is that at one point when I was at Fortune, and I was writing a thing that won, I guess, my last Loeb Award about some trashy securities Goldman Sachs sold. So I was asked, why does Goldman Sachs have these things called tranches, various, you know, slices of the thing? And I said, well, it's like Tyson Foods selling you chicken parts. The idea is that you can sell the parts for more than you pay for a chicken. And that's what I think won me the Loeb Award, you know, the chicken line. Or the other day, I'm writing a thing for the Washington Post, bored out of my mind with these endless pieces of legislation of stimulus. And I realized they all had ridiculous names like the CARES Act and the This Act. And people were going out of their way to come up with acronyms. So I ended up writing a whole sort of riff on acronyms, the only nonpartisan thing I think anyone's ever written about this. And I came up with the Get Rid of Acronyms Now Act. Can you spell that out? GROAN.
Yeah.
And that was a groaner.
Yeah.
And then I ended the column before I was attacked by English majors. So I'm just having fun, and I'm learning things, and judging, at least from my emails, I'm helping people understand stuff they wouldn't understand, and in many cases in ways they never thought of, which to me is the reward of what I do.
That's great. Thanks, Alan. I think Britt is going to put up a poll or two right now, some questions we thought would be interesting to get the audience's feedback on. So I think we can participate in this too, Alan and Gretchen.
I'm afraid to touch anything, but
yeah, no, you can, Alan, go ahead.
If I blow up the system, don't blame me.
We won't.
Ha! That's all. I click one thing and hit submit.
Yeah.
But any idiot can do that. I just proved that. Okay.
And Britt, okay. So there's our answers. So 45% said 30 years or more. Wow, we're almost in the minority here, guys. 27% said 20 years or more. 9% said 10 years or more. Between 5 and 10 years, that's 5% of the audience. And we have a good contingent of young people, less than 5 years in the field, 14%. That's great. And we're glad to have the younger people on board. So what I want to do now is I want to turn to a question that I think everybody needs to have in mind, and almost everybody seems to have a different answer too. And I also think the answer changes over time, which is who's our audience? Alan, when you write, whom do you have in mind? Do you have a person in mind, a demographic in mind, a type of reader in mind?
Well, what I figure is, I figure that my audience, my core audience, is people who are interested but not particularly knowledgeable, and I can show them things that they might otherwise not know. And if I do this well, even the people who are specialists and know much more about me, I'm sorry, know much more about what I'm writing than I do, they'll get something out of it, because if nothing else, they might learn how to explain it to their children, or if they're as old as me, their grandchildren. I'm just trying to explain stuff to people so they know what's going on in the world, and they know how to take care of themselves. I mean, you and Gretchen are much more, you're much meaner than I am. I'm just a nice guy. I mean, you guys go for the throat. I smile before I bite. But that's my audience, is someone who is interested but not knowledgeable.
Gretchen, what about you?
Well, you know, Jason, it kind of varies based on the outlet you're working for, right? So you work for the Wall Street Journal, which has, you know, I would say more sophisticated audience than, say, the New York Times or my current employer, NBC News. But so it does vary a little bit, but even if you are talking to sophisticated people, I think the importance of really explaining everything step by step and understanding it because you understand it yourself is helpful. You know, the sophisticates in the crowd can, you know, rush through that boilerplate that explains whatever it is you're writing about, but it really is important to speak English, you know, and I think so many people who go into financial reporting or readers of financial reports are put off. They have almost a mental block against it, against sort of, I'm not numerate, or I don't understand this stuff, or I can't explain it, which makes it crucial, really crucial for journalists to be able to explain this stuff in layman's terms, regardless of who your audience is. Now, obviously, there are going to be stories that really kind of dictate what you have to unpack, right? So during the 2008 mortgage crisis, everybody had to really unpack what had happened. And that was in some cases, you know, very complex securities that, you know, normally your average reader wouldn't have understood or known about or even cared about, but suddenly had to care about. So really, it's that role of what you explain and how you explain it. I like to think about, I'm writing a letter to my grandmother. And if she can understand it, and she was very smart, by the way, just not a financial person, you know, she's long gone. But if that person, that type of person can understand it, then I have succeeded.
Yeah, I write for a very specific person. I write for my high school English teacher's wife. Whom I'm still in touch. They're lifelong friends of mine. And she's extremely bright. She's got a master's in English literature, if I remember right. And I don't know, I think when I first came to the journal, you know, which would be 12 or 13 years ago now, she said, "Oh, I just read one of your columns." And she paused and she said, "I think it was good, but I didn't really understand it." And so my goal every time I sit down at my keyboard is to try to write something that she will understand. And I see them, you know, every couple of years or talk to them on the phone, even more often. And I don't really think I've succeeded yet. And that's one of the things that, frankly, keep me going, is one of these days I want to write a column that she understands. So I think we have another poll question coming up here. If everybody can see that, it's just a yes or no. And I know my answer. Good.
Hooray.
Wait a minute. Who are those no people?
Yeah, well, we should.
What's our sample size, or shouldn't I ask that?
Well, it's not, I don't think it's huge, but it's a few, I think it's a few dozen.
Okay.
And I don't know, maybe there's some definitional questions here, like what is general interest business journalism? But I think personally, I think it's worth doing more than ever. What do you guys think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the world gets more and more complex. It doesn't get simpler. The financial instruments get more complex. I mean, as I said earlier, they're all sort of a variation on the same theme and sometimes, but it really is important that we can explain what's going on. So I think it's absolutely crucial. You know, it couldn't be more clear to me that the intersection of business reporting, financial reporting, and everything else has become very clear. You know, the intersection of politics, local governments. It's really crucial for people to understand what's happening in that world. What do you think, Alan?
Well, I agree, because people need to know what's going on, and ideally explained in a way that they can relate to and understand, and not feel talked down to, not feel sneered at, not feel being treated like imbeciles. And also, I want to put in a pitch here for the idea of journalism for younger people. My youngest daughter, who's now a bankruptcy lawyer, she ended up marrying a journalist, but we let him in the family anyway. And she was a journalist for a few years, and she was trying to figure out what to do, and she wasting her time. And I told her what I've told any number of people 1 and 2 generations removed, downward from me, which is, give it a try. Because if you're a journalist and you're any good at it, you don't have to do it your whole life. You can learn to figure out things quickly. You can figure out how to explain them in a language approaching English. And you could be really good interviewing and quick on your feet. And that turned out to be very helpful to my daughter in law school and also in her job, because she can talk to people and explain things and understand it. So this isn't really the question, but I was looking for an opportunity to say that. So for heaven's sakes, you young people out there, maybe however many of you are who are listening to this, give it a try. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't work, you walk away with it with more than you came in. And that's all you can ask for in a job.
Yeah, so that's great, Alan. Thank you. What I want to do now is I want to ask a question that bears directly on our topic this evening, which is, how do you guys stay fresh? I mean, let's not kid anybody, including ourselves. Doing the same thing for decades on end isn't easy. Sometimes, speaking for myself, it can feel a bit like a grind. How do you recharge your batteries? How do you keep from just wearing out from constantly, hammering away at the same themes and, how do you avoid feeling frustrated and that you're just sort of spinning your wheels?
Well, Jason, I think that I would answer that by saying that the only time I'm frustrated is when I don't have a great story idea. Okay, so it's really not the frustration of feeling like you're saying the same thing over and over again, because Wall Street is a wonderful machine that continues to deliver sort of slightly different products, scams, scandals. You can use your expertise that you've gained from years of covering it, but the next iteration is usually different. There's usually something that wasn't in the last crisis, for instance. So you could write enormous amounts about mortgages and how people were hurt by mortgages, and how the bubble in housing created the crisis, et cetera. That was a completely different sort of reporting task than writing about Enron or WorldCom or Tyco or the accounting scandals of the early 2000s, and late 1999. So, you have to have the same kind of mindset of questioning the conventional wisdom about things, because there are a lot of people out there who will say, oh, nothing to see here, move along. But it really is, there really is so much variety that it sort of rhymes, but it doesn't. So you can use your expertise you've gained in covering past problems, but it's generally speaking different each time.
Yeah, Alan? That's great, Gretchen. Thank you.
Well, I haven't had a beat for a million years, so I've never been hemmed in, and nobody can figure out what I'm doing, including occasionally me. And I would just sort of run around and do stuff. And back when I worked in a newsroom, and as I'm sure you remember, and Carol remembers when we were at Fortune together, and Gretchen remembers, I just wander around and talk to people. Mm-hmm. And it's exciting and it's fun, and you share ideas. And the old joke about 1 and 1 is 3. People talk to each other and stuff gets sparked. Some of my best stories were accidents, where I'm going around and asking somebody, how's your kid doing? Or is your husband feeling better? And you end up in a conversation, and out of nowhere, inspiration strikes. So I never felt hemmed in. And if you've ever looked at my resume, I used to change jobs a lot back when I was a child, in terms of age. I'm still a child in terms of mentality and behavior. And I never got bored, because I never let myself get put into some narrow area where I had to write the same thing over and over and over again. I just never ended up that way, because I would just go off and do something different and not tell anybody, and just show up with the copy. And that's how I did it. It's harder now that, I'm sitting at home and I can't really go see anybody because I don't dare travel, and the newsrooms are closed. But I'm still having fun and getting excited and trying to figure out how to explain Trump's taxes in a humorous way. And I'm open to any help anybody wants to give me, in return for which I'll give you nothing. But it seems only fair. So, I mean, that's what I'm doing. The world keeps bringing me things to do, just like it keeps bringing Gretchen and you things to do.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm a little bit notorious for quipping once at a journalism conference that my job is to write the same thing at least 50 times a year, so that my editors and my readers don't know I'm repeating myself. But I did mean it as a bit of a joke. And I never really took it seriously. It's more of a little motivational, like, koan that I tell myself. And in fact, one of the ways I've stayed fresh, or at least I hope I've tried to stay fresh, is by by sort of reinventing myself a bit every few years. I mean, in the early to mid 90s, I was a mutual fund guy. Then I kind of broadened out to a broader investing reporter. Then I got very interested in behavioral economics and neuroscience. And all along, I've been very interested in business and financial history. And, you know, a few months ago, I launched a new column at the Journal that is actually a very old column called Back in Business, which looks at business history. And that has really been like a big dose of Geritol. For people in the audience who don't know what Geritol is, it's a youth potion. So we have a great question from the audience, from Olivia Carville, who asks, what advice would you give to younger financial reporters starting out? Is there a beat you'd advise them to aspire toward, or a subject you think they need to master in their early years? Alan, you keep saying you're the oldest. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, great. But I'm also the slowest. You just go out there and do it. Maybe, again, since I never intended to be a business journalist and got into it by accident and just followed it where it took me, I never sat and thought in terms of strategic terms of what am I doing, other than figuring out a few years ago, or actually many years ago, that I wanted to be a columnist so I could write what I wanted without running into, you know, problems, and I could change topics. But you want to go out, you want to learn something about numbers, you want to learn something about business, you want to learn something about people. But I would just see where it is I am and what seems like the right thing to do, and go around and just talk to people and ask them what they think. And you don't have to pay attention, but you know, you smile, especially with editors, you smile, you tell them what they want to hear, and then you do what you want. You just need to learn how to figure stuff out. And I don't know how to teach anybody that. And you need to try to make your editors, or in my case, even the copy editors, your friends, so you're all on the same team and they want to help you instead of seeing you as a burden and you don't see them as a burden. I mean, this may not be much of an answer, but it's the only answer I've got.
Gretchen, quick thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Olivia. And so what I would say, one of the best reasons to be a financial reporter, or I should say, one of the best aspects of financial reporting is that it is so rich with documents that you can use to tell your story, even if the participants that you're writing about don't want to have anything to do with you. So the documents that are available to business reporters are so much vaster than those that are available freely. I mean, to political reporters, to, you know, other reporters, sports reporters, I'm sure. And so it's really a terrific trove of information. So what I would answer to that question would be, go to an area that has a lot of wonderful document access. So for instance, an idea might be bankruptcy. So covering bankruptcies. Bankruptcy is famous for, you know, endless reams and reams of paper that have to be filed with the courts. There's obviously a lot of back and forth over time in these kinds of cases, but you get tremendous transparency in what's going on at these companies that are entering bankruptcy, trying to restructure, and coming out the other end. That's just one example. The other thing I think that is helpful to think about is think about areas of the business coverage that normally people don't flock to. So you could maybe have a sort of beat to yourself that maybe they don't flock to it because it's perceived as boring, but it isn't, and it's almost never boring. So, you know, I recall colleagues who did a tremendous job covering the insurance industry, which people think is deadly dull. And it doesn't have to be deadly dull. But so I would do two things. One, focus on where you get the most information, you know, freely. And two, maybe focus on beats where others have sort of abandoned them because they don't think it's sexy. And you believe me, you will find tremendous stories in there if you do that.
I think that's fabulous advice. I would just add two very quick thoughts, Olivia. One is, when I, going back to the story I told in my opening remarks, when I became the mutual funds editor at Forbes, and I'm embarrassed to say that was almost 30 years ago. What I did is every morning I read the Wall Street Journal, and I read every article that I thought could possibly have any bearing on mutual funds from start to finish, which was probably, I don't know, 20% of the entire content of the newspaper, now that I think about it. And what I did is I always read with a red pen in my hand. I always have. And I would circle every single name of anybody quoted in any of those stories. And then I would just call the person up and say, want to have breakfast? Want to have lunch? Want to have a drink? And I just got myself sourced up really fast with tons of people, most of whom I'm still in touch with, 28 years later. So find a beat where you can surface lots of people and get to know them and ask them, what do you think is going to happen next? Who's your biggest competitor? What keeps you up at night? What's going to go wrong? What's the next story? What are you reading? What are you thinking about? And then the other tidbit I would offer is just, get good with data. Old people like us, we're good with documents, but younger people are really a lot better than we are at coding and, working with computer software. And the more adept you can get at that, the sooner, the better you will be. We have a quick question from Steve Gandel about setbacks. How do you deal with it when a story blows up in your face and everything goes wrong? And how do you pick yourself up and move on? And you know what? I'm gonna take that first because there's a quick story I can tell. In 2010, I got very interested in some academic research about members of Congress who were trading securities according to their disclosure reports that they have to file, their annual disclosures. And, this academic research argued, if I remember, that members of Congress who had large holdings in bank stocks, the bank stocks that were based in their districts had a higher probability of being bailed out by TARP, the government relief program in 2008 and 2009. So if a member of Congress bought stock in your bank, then the Treasury Department, it seemed, funneled more money to your bank. And I thought that was really interesting, and I spent the entire week digging into it. And Wednesday, it started to kind of jiggle a little. Thursday, it started clanking. And Friday morning, it just all fell apart. And I had no confidence in the research. All my reporting was telling me that it couldn't be, it just wasn't true. And at my column, normally publishes at noon on Friday, and at 11:30, I met with my editors and I said, we gotta kill it. And my editors said, can you write another column? Which I did. I threw some column or other together in like an hour and a half, and we threw it up online. And I do mean threw it up. But over the weekend, it was like a pebble in my shoe. I just couldn't get it out of I couldn't stop feeling it. It was just irritating me. And I came in the next Monday and I went to the original source data of all these public filings that members of Congress have to make. And I just did my own digging. I pretended I had never read that research paper at all. And like after about 7 hours of reading these reports, I suddenly see that the ranking member of the House Committee on Financial Services is day trading call options on leveraged ETFs during the financial crisis. And I mean day trading. He was just like churning. He was trading dozens of times a day in securities tied to financial markets that he oversaw as a member of Congress. And it turned into one of the best columns I ever had. So, I mean, my takeaway is when you fall, know that you hit the ground with your head so it hurts, and then bounce up and just go right back at it. That's the best advice I can give. Alan, Gretchen, you don't have to jump in, but.
Well, it's a great question. And, you know, facing public criticism, of course, is a huge part of being a journalist. And, you know, we learned at the knee of Jim Michaels, who at Forbes, the brilliant, irascible, impossible, demanding editor, who, if you didn't get criticism or angry letters or whatever, would maybe say, you didn't get the whole story. Right. So, you know, criticism is important. Criticism keeps you on your toes, that's for sure. So I don't really, you know, I welcome criticism and really enjoy trying to talk with people about what it is they're saying so that we can, you know, get on the same page of music. As far as being, you know, in a position where you're feeling like you're feeling down, your story got scooped or your editor spiked it for whatever reason. I mean, everybody's been in that position, and it is a very, very upsetting period, moment, whatever. But you just have to pick yourself up, like Jason said, and go back at it and do a job, a better job the next time around. Because, you know, journalism is about, you know, trying to explain what's happening to people. The first draft of history is what people say it is. And you're not always going to get it right. And you have to accept that. But if you get it mostly right, and certainly are in the right, you know, right area code, or, you know, down the right line, going down the right line. But yes, it's really important to just pick yourself up if you do have those down points, and they will come in a career as long as ours.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add one other maybe grace note to what Gretchen said, which is, you know, I think it takes time and experience, and I think one of the benefits of doing this for a long time is eventually you pick up pattern recognition, right? So you know when to dig in and when to let go. So I did both with that story. So the first iteration of it was a complete, utter failure. It was a disaster. It was one of the worst moments I've ever had at the Journal, where I felt I had humiliated myself in front of my editors. I'd sort of fallen for a nonsensical sort of storyline, and my planning wasn't good, and I should have been more skeptical. So I just dropped it as soon as I realized it wasn't wasn't going to work. I should have realized that sooner, but once I concluded it wasn't going to work, I dropped it. But on the other hand, I realized that there had to be something there. It just wasn't the thing that I had found the first time I looked. So I went back and I looked at the same general topic, but I looked at it from scratch. And I just erased my mind and said, if I knew nothing about this, where would I look and what might I find? And I just went on this massive dig and turned up something that had been there all along that other reporters hadn't, I guess, recognized when they saw it. So we're getting a little short on time, so I want to jump to a couple other questions that we had in advance. Alan, talk for a minute about a story you're especially proud of and how you got it.
Well, the story for which I won my first Loeb Award when I was in Detroit, I ended up being the utilities writer, if you can believe such a thing, at the Detroit Free Press. And when I got there, they had some major screw up. They had some big expose of utilities, and then they retracted it. So just before I got there. So anyhow, I ended up, and all the utilities in North Carolina had warned the people in Detroit that the beast is coming. So, of course, all the utilities with any brains came to me and became my buddies. And there was one utility that didn't do it, and they ended up, well, too bad for them. But we were writing a whole big package, okay? And I was doing, the numbers part, and the political guys were doing the political part, and the person in charge of the program was doing, he was supposed to coordinate everything. He insisted on writing a story that I told him was wrong, and it was wrong. So here comes this series, and then comes this massive retraction. So then we're putting in, I'm sorry, I know I'm taking too much time, but then we put in my two pieces of the series for the Loeb Award, which it wins. But we didn't put in the whole series, and the political guys won all sorts of political prizes for their stuff, but my stuff wasn't part of it. And in the end, the Loeb Committee calls me one day and says, we like your stuff a lot. But it says on the bottom, first of a series. Send us the rest of the series. And I'm proud to say that when I talked to my editors, I insisted that we send the retraction as part of it, because I was not going to lie to these people. And I ended up winning anyway. And that Loeb Award helped make my career, because when I walked in the door at Forrest, I had a Loeb Award. So, I'm very proud of that. And I'm proud that we did the right thing.
Gretchen?
Well, I guess the reporting that we did at the New York Times right after the financial crisis was a real highlight for me, and it was a group effort. But I think that explaining in real time sort of what had happened and what was continuing really to happen in that fall of 2008 was really a highlight, as I said. But it's hard to pick one story. I do, value when I've helped readers. And one of the stories that I did is sort of on the same topic that we've touched on, which is complexity and how you have to explain how things work for people in layman's terms, was a story that I did about before the crisis about credit default swaps. Which of course were an integral part of the crisis, and were something that, your person average on Main Street didn't understand or know about, even have to know about. And so explaining sort of why credit default swaps were going to be a problem to, the New York Times reader was, I thought, an important story to do. And it's a story that did generate emails from people later on, much later on, saying, by the way, thank you so much for that story. You really helped me understand what was coming down the pike. And so those are the best stories, the ones that generate the thank you notes from people you don't know, in wherever they're from. And so that's just something that I remember very fondly.
Yeah, I think just to keep it brief, the stories I'm proudest of, I've been thinking about this, knowing this evening was coming up. They all seem to have come from one of three places. One place is persistence, having an intuition that there's some there, and just not giving up, picking up the phone and making the 7th or the 11th or the 14th phone call, dialing the number that didn't pick up last time, and eventually somebody picks up, and just let them talk, and sooner or later they tell you something that confirms your hunch. That's one place they come from. The other place they come from is luck, just sheer dumb luck, being in the right place at the right time, just having something fall in your lap that wouldn't have if you hadn't been where you were at that particular moment. And then the third place they come from is pattern recognition and attention to detail. One of the best stories I ever did came out of an asterisk. I was reading a Form 990, the annual tax return that nonprofits file. And where every other nonprofit I'd ever looked at had a detailed disclosure, this one had an asterisk. And it didn't go anywhere. It was an asterisk, and then you looked at the bottom of the page and there was no information, and there was no asterisk at the bottom of the page. It was just an asterisk. And I said, well, that's funny. I should research these people. And I did, and it turned out they were doing some very fishy stuff. So I want to ask each of you one last question that I think we have time for, which is, I think one thing that does prevent people from staying fresh if they stay in a field too long is when they get swollen heads, when they start to get vain and listen to themselves and think they have all the answers. And I'm obviously not going to name any names, and none of them are on this call, but we all know people like that and refuse to read them. How do you keep from getting a swelled head? What keeps you from being a complete egomaniac? Let me ask Alan first.
Oh, you mean I'm not a complete egomaniac?
I used the adjective.
Okay. No, I'm just making sure. I always remember the things I messed up the most. And I decided, I don't want to do that. And just like you and Gretchen, there are people I just can't bear to read because they're looking into their navels and writing what I call navel columns. You look into your navel and you write what you see. And I just never could bring myself to do that because it just didn't seem worth doing. And I've walked away from zillions of stories and, because they didn't work or stuff like that. And that keeps you humble. And Steve Gandel and I worked endlessly on something, but in the end, we couldn't make work. And it was an annoying experience, but it's very humbling because you realize that no matter how many prizes you've won or your supposed talents, it doesn't mean you're going to bat 1,000. And as long as you remember that even if you bat 400, it means you're screwing up 3 out of 5 times. That's very humbling.
Yeah. Gretchen?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that there are a lot of journalists who are self-important and self-absorbed. And it's unfortunate because, when that takes over a journalist, they stop listening to their sources. And so the thing that I just keep remembering over and over again, first of all, is that, as Alan says, you're always worrying about your mistakes, and you're fallible. You're fallible. And that the work you do is really only as good as your way of, acknowledging the help that you get from others, whether it's sources, whether it's colleagues, whether it's editors. It's a group effort. It's never just one person doing it. And I just think, being a kind colleague really helps keep you grounded in that way. And it's just a very important skill to be able to do. And I think it keeps you grounded in your ability to talk with sources and to get their help. Because essentially journalists are basically asking for help all day long when you're talking to sources. So how on earth can you be asking for help if you're thinking that you're, God's gift to everybody? It just doesn't work. So I am very aware of that and always, always thinking about it.
Yeah, a quick word from me on this. One of the things I do is, I don't write it down because I don't want to anchor on it, but I always start out asking myself, once I pick a topic, what do I think about this topic? Where do I think I'm going to come out? And I have that in my head as a very loose idea. Then I do my research, then I do my reporting. And I would say 95 to 98% of the time, I come out at least slightly differently than where I expected to. And that's what I'm going to say keeps me from having a swelled head. If I had a swelled head, I'd be the last to know it. But I don't think my head is too swollen. And I think that's the reason why, because essentially every week, my column proves me wrong. And I know it because I feel it as it's happening. And I think that's really the key. Because, there are people who know what they think before they start writing. And presumably that's why they don't do a lot of reporting, or they just interview a cab driver on the way to the airport in Morocco or something, or the king. But, I don't know any kings. And if I did, I wouldn't talk to them much. I would talk to the courtiers and the people in the palace kitchen, because they know what's really going on. And I think it's a lifelong struggle. And, because people are constantly telling us how smart we are and what good writers we are and all of that nonsense. And the only way you can stand a chance of being any of those things is by not believing them. So, which is a little hard. So, Britt, do we have time for another question or two? Or should we say goodnight? All right, let's take one more. I want to ask each of you to talk about luck in your careers, and not just when you were lucky or how you were lucky, but whether you've ever been able to sort of harness it. And maybe we'll make this the last question. It's a nice note to end on. Gretchen, you want to go first?
Okay, well, this is kind of a funny little story, and it certainly is lucky. So when I started my career on Wall Street, or when I started interviewing for my career on Wall Street, it just so happened to come after a lawsuit that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had filed against major Wall Street banks because they were not hiring enough women. And so my ability to even get an interview, forget about getting the job, was really because of the government suing Wall Street because they had not hired enough women. So it was interesting. That's a certainly right place, right time story. But I would say that's a good example of how luck can really drive, your career and make a difference.
Alan, what about you?
All right, I've told you the luck story of the Loeb Award, where I won it as an individual instead of as part of a team because someone else on the team screwed up. So that was lucky. The other thing that was really lucky was running into James Walker Michaels, the editor of Forbes. I come wandering in there from Detroit. I don't know anything. I'm taking an effective loss in pay. I got 3 kids. I don't have any money. And I didn't know enough to be afraid of him. And I would just talk to him. I just write my stories, throw them in. He'd edit them. I'd go home on the train. And then I found out that wasn't usually how it worked. He used to torture almost everybody, but he chose not to torture me. And then I got lucky because he defended me against the late Malcolm Forbes. And, he took my side of it. I was just amazed. And I was just fortunate that Michaels and I, rocky as our relationship occasionally was. And once I stormed out in the middle of the night and just took some 2 a.m. train home, Michaels calls my house. My wife, who had never met him, picks up the phone and she recognizes Michaels because I used to come home and imitate him. She says, "He's not home yet, Mr. Michaels." They didn't even have to introduce himself. And, it all went away and it was all fine. So I was just very lucky that A, I didn't know enough to be afraid, and B, when I knew enough to be afraid, I wasn't afraid, and he turned out to be my buddy, and I never would have thought that would happen.
Well, so I'm going to tell a little story. So sometime in the late 90s, I did a story I loved about a British psychologist who studied luck as a science. And he ended up writing a book about it. His name was Richard Wiseman. And it was an interesting book, not great, but good. And I had a wonderful interview with him, very long and interesting interview. And I said to him, well, how did you get interested in this as a field? And he said, well, we decided we would study luck. And we began with a bunch of these field interviews with people. And this woman comes in and she says, my husband died and my son has a terminal illness, but I still consider myself a lucky person. And he said to her, well, why? So many bad, terrible things have happened to you. And she said, I always have a date on Saturday night. And it turned out that what she had done was she had taught herself a little rule, which is after her husband had died and she was grieving and trying to recover, she said, every time I walk in a room from a different room and there are more than 3 people in it, I'm going to think of a color and I'm going to walk up to the first person wearing that color and say, hello, my name is so-and-so, introduce myself and start talking. And you know what? Every Saturday night I have a date. And I thought this was just the most wonderful story, and I mulled it over. And I've always been a very shy, reserved person. And from that point onward, whenever I walked in a big room, I would just close my eyes for a second and I would say blue or red or green or yellow or whatever, and then open my eyes and walk up to a person with blue socks or a green tie or a yellow skirt or whatever it might be, and start talking with them. And I tried to let that permeate my attitude. And I found that not just being a little more outgoing, but also structuring serendipity, trying to design your environment a little bit so that you meet new people or you get a different perspective on things. It could be as simple as when you're walking down the street, you don't just look in front of you, you look one flight up to see if you can observe anything in the windows. It might be when you're sitting at your desk in your office, if you have one, You look out the window and you notice what people across the way are doing. Anything that breaks your usual mental routines and gets you out of yourself can turn, I think there's a little bit of a skill to being lucky. And I know that it has worked for me and has given me some of my best stories and has helped keep me fresh. So I think we've run a bit over time, and I want to thank everyone for joining us and making this a wonderful evening. It was a delight to have Gretchen and Alan with me, and I hope you all enjoyed the conversation.